Brookings. I'm Mike O'Hanlon with the Foreign Policy Program. We're thrilled to have you all here today to discuss the Trump administration's nuclear posture review, an important document that just came out on Groundhog's Day, February 2nd of this year, following the earlier national security strategy of December and the national defense strategy of January. So the administration is really doing a nice job keeping its clockwork running smoothly on issuing all this guidance prior to now the unveiling of its budget request. We're thrilled to have David Trachtenberg beginning our discussion today. He has one of the longer titles, but one of the more important titles in the Pentagon. He's the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, a job that Jim Miller also had, and we'll talk about that in our panel that follows with Jim and others. But for now, I want to introduce David, who has been one of the administration's most important authors and voices on the conceptualization and framing and writing of this document that we now have available, that, by the way, all of you can access, as you're well aware, on the Internet. It's about a 70-page document. It's much longer than the unclassified version of the National Defense Strategy. Has a lot of elaboration of Trump administration thinking on a number of issues, and we're going to hear about that today. David will give some short remarks, then field some of your questions, and then we'll swap out a little before the 11 o'clock mark for our panel discussion that I'll moderate and that I'll introduce the panelists for when we get to that point. Let me just say a couple more things about David. This is his second or third or fourth time in government. He was also an important figure in the Bush administration working on international security policy, which means he was thinking a lot about relations with NATO and other allies and thinking about their nuclear posture review of the early 2000s that he was also an important contributor towards. He hails from California by way of college, went to USC, studied foreign service at Georgetown, was involved in a number of jobs in Washington, as I mentioned earlier, including most recently with Shortwave Consulting, a job that he held just before joining the Trump administration last summer when he was confirmed by the U.S. Senate for this job. So without further ado, please welcome Mr. David Trachtenberg.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here at Brookings. I very much appreciate the invitation. And it's good to see so many people out here on such a dreary morning. Thank you for making the trek out here to participate in this. It's really good to be here, and it's been a while since I've been here, and always appreciate the opportunity to come back. One correction I would note to Michael's very, very generous introduction, and that is my title, which was indeed the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, has now been changed. It's actually been shortened by one word, thanks to the National Defense Authorization Act, which was signed into law a couple of months ago or so. The word principal has now been dropped from all the Deputy Undersecretary titles, because there is only one Deputy Undersecretary. And so now I have a better chance of actually fitting my title on a business card. So as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, again, it is my pleasure to be here and to talk about this very critical issue, the nuclear posture review. As you all know, each post-Cold War president has, early in his first term, conducted a review of U.S. nuclear policy, posture, and programs. President Trump's first national security presidential memorandum, issued 1 week into the new administration, directed Secretary Mattis to undertake the fourth such review of U.S. nuclear policy. The aim of the review was to ensure the United States' nuclear deterrent is modern, robust, flexible, resilient, ready, and appropriately tailored to deter 21st century threats and reassure allies. The Department of Defense conducted this review, along with the Departments of State and Energy, and in consultation with allies and experts from inside and outside the government. The resulting 2018 Nuclear Posture Review establishes the Department of Defense's priority as maintaining a safe and effective nuclear arsenal that can effectively contribute to 4 key goals: deterring nuclear and non-nuclear attack, assuring allies and partners, achieving U.S. objectives should deterrence fail, and hedging against an uncertain future. The NPR also emphasizes that U.S. nuclear policy will continue to contribute to U.S. nuclear non-proliferation goals. Now, these roles are consistent with past priorities of U.S. nuclear policy. Indeed, the 2018 NPR maintains long-standing nuclear policies adopted by both Democratic and Republican administrations. For example, the new NPR recognizes the need for the nuclear triad and sustains the previous administration's plan for modernizing the aging U.S. nuclear triad of land-based, sea-based, and air-breathing delivery platforms, as well as its supporting nuclear infrastructure and command and control. Consistent with the 2010 NPR, conducted by the prior administration, the 2018 NPR declares that the United States would only consider using nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend U.S. vital interests. In addition, the NPR also reaffirms the U.S. commitment to arms control and nonproliferation by maintaining support for the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and by sustaining the extended deterrent for allies. Extended deterrence is critical to their security and promotes nuclear nonproliferation by checking their need to acquire their own nuclear weapons. Now, each of the previous NPRs has rightly emphasized that U.S. nuclear policy must be responsive to the threat environment of its time. The 2018 NPR addresses the reality that while the Cold War has been over for decades, a much more challenging nuclear threat environment has developed since the previous 2010 Nuclear Posture Review. This is the reality that confronted the new administration when it began its Nuclear Posture Review. Accordingly, the 2018 NPR is grounded in a realistic assessment of the contemporary security environment, one that recognizes a return of great power competition and the increasing salience of nuclear weapons in the arsenals and doctrines of potential adversaries. For example, since 2010, the Russian leadership has made repeated, explicit nuclear threats to U.S. NATO allies and others, brandishing Russian nuclear weapons in a way we really had not seen since the height of the Cold War. Russia is actively modernizing and expanding its strategic and non-strategic nuclear weapons, and doing so in continuing violation of the landmark 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF, treaty. Like Russia, China is pursuing expansionist moves at the expense of its neighbors, including key U.S. allies, and doing so also through the threat of force. China also continues to expand its nuclear capabilities in both quantity and quality. Since 2010, China has announced the development of or fielded new ICBMs and theater-range ballistic missiles, a new sea-launched ballistic missile, a new ballistic missile submarine, and a new strategic bomber. China's intentional lack of transparency regarding the scope and scale of its nuclear modernization serves only to magnify uncertainties about its future intent. Also, since 2010, North Korea has rapidly increased the pace of its nuclear testing and of theater, intercontinental, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. At the same time, North Korea has repeatedly made explicit nuclear threats to the United States and our allies in the region. And while Iran's nuclear future remains uncertain, its malign activities and hegemonic aspirations in the Middle East are not. Now, in contrast to these developments over the past decade, the United States has built no new types of nuclear weapons or delivery systems, other than the F-35, for the past 2 decades. We have instead sustained our nuclear deterrent with life extension programs, keeping systems and platforms decades beyond their designed service life. Former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter rightly observed that if there is an arms race underway, the United States clearly is not a participant. It is clear that our attempts to lead by example in reducing the numbers and salience of nuclear weapons in the world have not been reciprocated. Since the 2010 NPR, the prospects for great power military confrontation have expanded, while both Russia and China have increased the number and salience of their nuclear weapons programs. The intentional restraint reflected in U.S. nuclear policies did not lead the rest of the world to follow the same path. Now, this is not a unique conclusion reflected in the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review. The U.S. National Intelligence Council recognized this great difference in the U.S. and Russian approaches to nuclear weapons back in 2012, concluding, quote, "Nuclear ambitions in the U.S. and Russia over the last 20 years have evolved in opposite directions. Reducing the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. security strategy is a U.S. objective, while Russia is pursuing new concepts and capabilities for expanding the role of nuclear weapons in its security strategy," end quote. The 2018 NPR responds to this increasingly challenging threat environment not by changing long-standing tenets of U.S. nuclear policy that have bipartisan support, but by emphasizing the maintenance of those capabilities needed to effectively deter war in the current environment. It also seeks to clarify U.S. policies to help remove the potential for mistaken calculation by potential adversaries that limited nuclear first-use threats or escalation can provide them with any possible useful political or military advantage. Correcting the potential for such calculations is now a key to maintaining deterrence of nuclear war. In this regard, I'd like to address 3 of the corresponding outcomes of the 2018 NPR: the clarification of our nuclear policy and the recommended supplements to U.S. deterrence capabilities, all of which have been subject to considerable news accounts and what I would consider to be considerable mischaracterizations in much of the public commentary. First, let me say the 2018 NPR returns deterrence of nuclear attack against us, our allies and partners, to the top priority of U.S. nuclear policy. Given the security environment and the changes in that environment that I have highlighted, this is a prudent, realistic, and I would argue necessary change. Second, to strengthen deterrence of nuclear and non-nuclear strategic attacks, the 2018 NPR clarifies U.S. declaratory policy regarding nuclear weapons. Doing so does not expand the circumstances for nuclear use or lower the nuclear threshold, as some commentators have suggested. Rather, while maintaining a measure of ambiguity, It provides some clarification regarding what might constitute an extreme circumstance that could lead to U.S. consideration of a possible nuclear response. This clarification enhances deterrence and raises the nuclear threshold by reducing the potential for adversary miscalculation. As potential adversary non-nuclear capabilities continue to become more and more lethal, U.S. policy must make clear that non-nuclear strategic attacks that would have catastrophic effects on the American people and our allies must also be deterred. Finally, in addition to prioritizing deterrence and adding some clarity to extreme circumstances, the 2018 NPR also recommends 2 nuclear programs to strengthen U.S. capabilities to deter attacks and to assure allies. First is the modification of a small number of existing submarine-launched ballistic missiles to include a low-yield option. Second is the pursuit of a nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. Despite the awesome capabilities of our existing nuclear triad, Russia's actions indicate that Moscow may hold the mistaken belief that its numerous and diverse non-strategic nuclear arsenal provides useful options for limited first-use nuclear threats or employment. We believe the 2 supplements to the U.S. nuclear arsenal presented in the NPR are important to help correct this misperception and convince Russia and any other potential adversary that the United States and its allies will not be coerced by the threat of limited nuclear first use. Now, the other point I would make is that neither of these capabilities, these 2 supplemental capabilities, is a new capability. The low-yield option for submarine-launched ballistic missiles involves a relatively minor modification to an existing warhead. And the sea-launched cruise missile is a capability that the United States possessed for decades until recently. In addition, neither of these capabilities will require underground nuclear testing, and both are compliant with all U.S. treaty obligations. These capabilities are intended to strengthen the deterrence of war and the assurance of allies, thereby helping to ensure that nuclear weapons are not employed or proliferated. We must recognize that effective deterrence is about tailoring our capabilities to a potential adversary's calculations regarding the use of nuclear force to ensure that it can never appear to be a useful option. We must assess our capabilities relative to the doctrine, exercises, statements, threats, and behavior of potential adversaries. And the capabilities recommended by the 2018 NPR are tailored to raise the threshold for nuclear use and to do so with minimal changes to the U.S. nuclear posture. We believe the policy announced in the NPR is a reasonable response to the changes in the current security environment. Now, let me be clear. The goal of our recommendations, the goal of the recommendations contained in the 2018 NPR, is to deter war, not to fight one. Modernization of the U.S. nuclear deterrent, adoption of tailored defense strategies with flexible capabilities, and clarification on the role of nuclear weapons all send a strong deterrence message to potential adversaries while also reassuring our allies. Finally, the 2018 NPR helps ensure that our diplomats speak from a position of strength. Russia has little incentive to negotiate seriously about nuclear reductions without a robust and ongoing U.S. nuclear modernization program. Indeed, Russian leaders have said as much. And as Secretary Mattis recently testified, Russia is unlikely to give up something to gain nothing. Critics who favor eliminating U.S. systems in the face of an expansive Russian nuclear modernization effort are undermining America's greatest bargaining leverage and the prospects for future arms agreements. The 2018 Nuclear Posture Review is one of several important reinforcing U.S. national security documents meant to guide U.S. policy in an increasingly complex and challenging world. Much as we might prefer otherwise, U.S. nuclear weapons are the bedrock of American and allied security. As Colin Gray has said, nuclear weapons are a regrettable necessity in the real world. After the slaughter of 2 world wars, they have prevented large-scale great power conflict for more than 7 decades. In an era of renewed great power competition, adversaries, allies, and the American people should know that the United States has the will and the flexible, resilient nuclear forces needed to protect the peace. Before turning things back over to Michael and the panel here for discussion, let me again take this opportunity to thank the Brookings Institution for the opportunity to come here today to briefly present the department's work and to engage in an informed discussion on these issues that are tremendously vital to our nation's security. I appreciate your being here and your attention, and I look forward to your questions and insights. Thank you all very much. Questions? Comments? Suggestions? Recommendations? Yes, sir.
Please wait for a microphone if you could, so we can get this immortalized on C-SPAN. So can you have a microphone, please, in the back? All the way towards the front here on the left.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you are going to get involved in a low-yield weapon exchange, how do you figure you're going to prevent it from escalating to more conventional size nuclear weapons?
I don't think of it in terms of getting involved in an exchange at all. The way we look at this, again, is what we are trying to do is we are trying to prevent an exchange, not engage in one. And therefore, it's incumbent upon us to think about how do we do that in a world that has changed dramatically since the last NPR was done and reflects developments by Russia and other states that tend to suggest increased reliance on nuclear weapons and the possibility that nuclear weapons, even in a limited way, might have some degree of political or military utility. And so the recommendations that we're proposing to include a low-yield ballistic missile and a sea-launched nuclear-armed cruise missile are intended not to engage or not to fight a nuclear war or not to even suggest that one could be fought in a way that is limited, however one wants to define the term limited, but are designed to try to convince adversaries and potential opponents that they should not feel that they have some exploitable advantage by using a capability for which the United States has no counter. So the very purpose of what we're doing is war prevention, not war fighting. And I understand the characterizations, many of the characterizations that I have seen, tend to suggest that what we are looking to do is engage in precisely the kind of limited strikes that your question suggests. I'd suggest looking at it differently. What we're trying to do is prevent an opponent from believing that such a course of action is actually useful or beneficial.
So you believe a small deterrent is more effective than a big deterrent? I'm talking about the size of nuclear weapons, or explosive yield of nuclear weapons.
Sure. What we believe is having flexible nuclear capabilities tailored to specific circumstances makes the most sense for deterrence and for assurance. Obviously, no two states are alike. We have multiple threats that we are trying to deter, and to do that may take flexible capabilities. In some cases, certain types of military capabilities may be sufficient for deterrence. In other cases, opponents may see them as less sufficient. So what we are trying to do is ensure that there is a necessary flexibility and resilience and robustness in terms of the capabilities we have at our disposal in order to deter, dissuade opponents from believing they have any kind of military advantage that they believe they can use either to initiate conflict or escalate conflict. That is the entire purpose of the recommendations that you find in the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review. Sir.
Hi, thank you. I would like to know if you're concerned that enhancing nuclear capabilities can be seen as a contradiction to the commitment that you mentioned of non-proliferation agreements, and if it can also promote an arms race.
I would answer this way. First of all, I don't see it as a contradiction whatsoever. In fact, I mentioned our extended deterrent that we extend to over 24 plus allies overseas. I would argue that our nuclear arsenal, the arsenal that we have that serves that extended deterrent function, is quite possibly the most successful non-proliferation tool we've had in our toolkit, literally for decades, because it has dissuaded friends and allies from feeling the need to develop or acquire nuclear weapons of their own. So from a non-proliferation standpoint, the nuclear capabilities we have, I think, very much support U.S. non-proliferation objectives. In terms of the question about an arms race, I've seen that commentary as well a number of times. I go back to the statement that I read from former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. If there's an arms race, the United States is not participating. In fact, the United States has not been participating for quite some time. If you look at the details of what the Russian Federation has been doing in terms of its own nuclear modernization program, if you look at Russian military doctrine, if you look at the exercises, the strategic force exercises that Russia has conducted, a number of which really have been unrivaled since the days of the Cold War, a number of which involve the exercise of their strategic nuclear forces and, in fact, the simulated first use of nuclear weapons. If you look at all of the systems that the Russians have been engaged in modernizing in recent years, it's very difficult for me to understand how what we are proposing to do in this nuclear posture review in terms of maintaining the efficacy of the existing triad and developing these two supplemental, I believe very modest supplemental capabilities that I mentioned, in any way, shape, or form heralds an arms race. We're not looking to match what Russia is doing weapon for weapon. We're not looking to do to build up the thousands of non-strategic nuclear weapons that the Russians have in their arsenal. Again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to convince potential adversaries, whether it be Russia, China, North Korea, whomever, that there is no benefit to them of pursuing a course of action which might lead to their actual use of nuclear weapons first, or in some kind of so-called limited way. What we want to do is make absolutely certain that the costs to an opponent, to an aggressor, of any nuclear use far outweigh any perceived benefits that they might think would accrue to them. That is the essence of what we have recommended in this NPR. And again, I would argue it's relatively consistent with sort of the traditional U.S. nuclear policies as they have evolved over many decades. So again, I think there is much more continuity to this particular NPR and its conclusions and recommendations vis-a-vis prior NPRs than differences. There's a lot of continuity there, and that continuity has been occasionally overlooked.
Thank you, sir. I come from a country that was under an extended nuclear deterrence relationship with the United States, New Zealand, but then decided that our security would be better if we were non-nuclear and not a nuclear target. So we withdrew from that nuclear deterrence relationship. And we're now signed the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Would you be supportive of other of the allies of the United States deciding that for their national interests they would be more secure not to be in a nuclear alliance and also signing the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons?
Well, of course, it's up to individual states and individual allies to decide what approach they want to take. But I will tell you, we have had similar discussions and debates in the NATO context for many years. NATO remains a nuclear alliance. I don't see that changing in the near future. There is a general recognition among allies that nuclear deterrence remains important. I think there's also a general recognition that because of some of the changes that I alluded to that have taken place in the world environment in recent years, the issue of preventing nuclear conflict has taken on a growing importance, and the role of nuclear weapons in doing that is also generally recognized by allies. So I don't want to obviously speak for what other countries should or shouldn't do, but I think it's clear not only to the United States, but it's clear to U.S. allies abroad as well, many of whom share our threat perceptions and understanding of some of the dangers that we see posed by others, and share our recognition that it is critically important, perhaps more so now than ever before, to make sure we have the wherewithal and the capabilities and the resolve to ensure that potential adversaries do not miscalculate and do not believe they have some kind of advantage that is exploitable, that they can take advantage of. So, I think that is in the sort of mainstream of U.S. nuclear tradition. I don't see anything odd or unusual about that. But again, whether we like nuclear weapons or we don't, we might all wish that we lived in a world without them. But we also have to recognize reality, and the reality is nuclear weapons do exist. Some states have gone in a direction quite opposite the direction that the United States has gone in terms of the size of its nuclear arsenal and its attention to its focus on nuclear weapons as part of its national security strategy. That's a disquieting development in my view. And it's one that we need to be forthright in confronting, straightforward. Yes, sir.
I appreciate your presentation. Thank you for it. And I've learned a lot from it. But I wonder whether your approach may, in fact, run afoul of some of the very things that you warn other people about, particularly thinking about how other countries will view our strategy. When we decide to build new non-strategic nuclear weapons, why will that not appear to Russia and to other countries to be a ratification of their new strategy of escalation to de-escalate and an acceptance of limited nuclear war? And why is it that the administration decided to focus only or predominantly upon nuclear responses to a possible limited nuclear attack rather than looking to the area of conventional response in which we have such an overwhelming superiority? Remembering, of course, that in the old days when we thought the Russians had a conventional superiority, we were the ones who believed in first strike.
Let me say this. There is nothing in the Nuclear Posture Review that assumes an automatic nuclear response to any particular contingency. There is an element of strategic ambiguity there, which absolutely does not rule out our ability to respond in other ways as well, in ways of our choosing, appropriately to the nature of the threat that we face. That could be response with conventional arms. It could be some other type of response. There is nothing in the NPR that says the United States, under this or that circumstance, will respond with nuclear weapons. There's no automaticity there. And so your point about other possible types of response is certainly valid, and it's not negated by anything in the Nuclear Posture Review. Why is the focus of this review on nuclear weapons? Because it is a nuclear posture review. And the tasking was to review U.S. nuclear posture. So that, of course, is what the review did. In terms of the possible reactions of Russia, China, and other states, I have no doubt that anything the United States does or proposes to do would likely generate negative reactions on the part of those who would prefer the United States not to take any action at all to bolster or improve its nuclear deterrent capabilities. So it's not surprising to read or hear statements from Russian officials or Chinese officials or North Korean officials critical of the Nuclear Posture Review and suggesting that the Nuclear Posture Review does precisely the opposite of what it is intended to do. But I think the document itself has to be taken as a whole. And I think the context that is provided within the review itself in terms of our assessment of the overall nuclear security environment provides a realistic framework and rationale for understanding why we have come to the conclusions and recommendations we have come to. Now, look, I realize certainly reasonable people can have reasonable disagreements over this or that specific recommendation or the rationale behind it. That's what makes debate over this issue so robust. But nevertheless, I would encourage everyone, if you haven't read the full document, I'd encourage you to do that. Take a look at how the security environment is described and assess the conclusions and recommendations of the NPR in the context of our assessment. See whether or not it holds together and makes sense as you do that. I think it is a logical approach. I think it is a rational approach. And I think it's an approach that is, in fact, tailored to the kinds of 21st century threats we currently confront and are likely to confront in the future. So regardless of what some opponents might suggest, I think we've kind of hit it right in this particular review. I think it's balanced. I think it's consistent with what U.S. nuclear policy has been by and large for decades. And I think it's appropriately tailored to the different threats that we face today. Sure, Bob.
Dave, thanks so much for joining us at Brookings today and making the case for the Trump NPR. To achieve its ambitious objectives, modernization of the triad, the DOE nuclear complex, command and control system, the supplements you mentioned, and so forth. These are expensive. There's a high price tag associated with them. You're going to need strong bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress. Presumably you and other senior officials have engaged in consultations with members of Congress to make the case for the NPR and to get their support. How have those consultations gone? Are you confident that you're going to have the necessary domestic consensus for this ambitious program? And what are the particular challenges? What are the 2 or 3 challenges when you think of the talking points you're going to use in the Congress, what are the challenges you need to confront?
Very, very good question. And I would say so far, our discussions with others, with folks on the Hill and elsewhere, Democrats, Republicans, I would generally characterize them as overwhelmingly positive. Obviously, not everybody supports everything that we have proposed here in the Nuclear Posture Review. There are some that believe we go too far. There are others who believe we don't go far enough, which again just goes to show you in Washington you can't please everyone, all of the time. But I think by and large I have been quite pleased by what I have seen as generally bipartisan support for what we have done and what we are attempting to do with this particular NPR. Again, it's not, universal, but it's quite substantial, I would argue. The biggest challenges, I think, are several-fold. Number one, explaining the rationale behind what it is we're proposing in a way that is understandable. This is, of course, and everyone here in this room knows it, it's a very esoteric issue. But it's an issue, because of that, it's also an issue that occasionally lends itself to mischaracterization or misinterpretation. Explaining what we are proposing to do and why we are proposing to do it in a way that makes sense to multiple audiences, I think is a challenge, but is critically important to do if we are going to not only generate but maintain a level of bipartisan support that is needed to actually carry out the recommendations that we have proposed here. The other challenge, of course, you alluded to it in your question, is the issue of funding. No question that what we are talking about carries a substantial price tag. Just the very modernization of our existing triad is not an inexpensive undertaking. Relatively speaking to other things that we spend defense dollars on, it's a relatively minor fraction overall of the defense budget, maybe some 3 to 4%, which historically is rather low if you look at past periods of modernization and recapitalization of the triad. So, from my perspective, it's not so much a question of affordability. We can afford to do what we need to do when we're talking about such weighty issues as preventing nuclear war. Secretary Mattis likes to say, we can afford survival. And he's absolutely right. We can afford to do that. We simply need to be able to, number one, understand that doing so will require time. This is not something that will be done overnight. And it will require a commitment of resources that must be sustained over a period of time to get us to the point where we've actually achieved the objectives we've set forth. That in itself is a reasonably heavy lift. I would argue that as difficult as it was for us to spend the last year sort of constructing the NPR in a way that is reflective of the current security environment, that was probably the easy part. Now that we've done it, that easy part is over. The hard part will be trying to ensure that the recommendations are sustainable and actually carried out in order to accomplish the objectives that we set forth from a policy prescription. So the challenge is just beginning. And by the way, this is a challenge that will last well beyond this administration into the next administration. Again, this is not something that can be done overnight or with a flick of a switch.
So I'll now ask the panel to join me on stage. We're not going to take any break. We'll just go straight into that. But please join me as well in thanking Secretary Trachtenberg. Well, thank you, everybody, for staying on with us, and our thanks to Secretary Trachtenberg. I'd like to very briefly now introduce the distinguished panel we have up here. We'll go straight into a discussion. We don't have a lot of time. We'll be here until 12. We'll have the last half hour or so for your questions. So let me very briefly introduce folks, then we'll go down the line with some questions tailored to each, have another round of discussion here, and then go to you. Just to my left is Madeleine Creedon. She was, and in this case, the word principal deputy, I think, does apply, principal deputy administrator of the Department of Energy's main arm that works on the nuclear warheads of our arsenal, the National Nuclear Security Administration. And so a lot of the issues concerning warhead modernization or the potential need to beef up the warhead complex in case we need to modernize and expand in the future, which the NPR addresses, will be questions that I will want to pose to Secretary Creighton. She also has considerable experience at the Department of Defense, where she was an assistant secretary, and also on Capitol Hill. In fact, that's one of the distinguishing characteristics of almost everybody up here today, is Capitol Hill experience as well, which is important for the reason Bob Einhorn got at a minute ago as we think about resources. Just to Madeline's left is Dr. Jim Miller, who was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Obama administration. Prior to that, he was Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under Michelle Flournoy in the first term, when he helped write the Nuclear Posture Review of 2010 that we've heard referenced several times. That was the previous NPR. And my opening question for Jim and for the panel in general is going to be, in fact, how much continuity is there from the 2010 NPR and how much change? And we'll get to that in just a moment. One more point on Jim. If you read his bio, you'll also notice, just as General Marty Dempsey did in the farewell speech he gave for Jim, that Jim was an excellent tennis player at Stanford. And I can attest to that. If you see the scar on my face, this is, well, only with slight exaggeration, Jim running me into the wall of the indoor facility with his slice second serve to the ad court. But that's just a personal note that I appreciate the indulgence. Just to Jim's left is Bob Einhorn, who had a distinguished career in government, but has come in and out of think tanks and done a lot of academic writing throughout his career as well. He's currently here with me at Brookings as another senior fellow in the foreign policy program, just as I am. Bob was Hillary Clinton's main advisor on nonproliferation strategy and worked very hard on issues like North Korea and Iran, as well as arms control treaties more generally in the Obama administration, had been at CSIS, had been in the Clinton administration. A great, distinguished career. I think began at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency back in the 1980s and has done many things since. And finally, James Acton, a physicist by training, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, holds the Jessica Matthews Chair there, and has done a lot of the most rigorous technical writing on arms control, including on broad subjects such as the potential long-term hope for complete nuclear disarmament, but also questions of how do we build a stabilizing, safe, and secure deterrent in the meantime. So thrilled to have them all here. And Dr. Miller, if I could begin with you, please, I would be really fascinated to hear your comparison of the 2010 NPR to this one. Just how much change, how much continuity?
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for your very kind introduction and exaggeration of my tennis capabilities. Michael is actually a terrifically talented player, as well as an intellect. So 3 quick points on the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review relative to the 2010 review. First is that there is a very strong thread of continuity, both with respect to the policy and with respect to the programs of the reviews. At the policy level, this NPR reiterates what the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review had to say about the U.S. Policy toward the employment of nuclear weapons, and that is that nuclear weapons would be used only under extreme circumstances that threaten U.S. vital interests or the vital interests of our allies and partners. This Nuclear Posture Review reiterates the so-called negative security assurance, which says that the United States will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states that are compliant with their non-proliferation treaty obligations. And finally, this review, like the past review, rejects no first use or so-called sole purpose for nuclear weapons, but makes clear, in my view, that the fundamental role of nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear weapons use. So at the policy level, a lot of consistency, and similarly the support of arms control, including New START, and a desire to return the Russians to compliance with the INF Treaty, support of non-proliferation as well. And finally, a reiteration that the United States will abide by the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and not seek nuclear testing, although this administration says it will not pursue ratification of that treaty. So from a policy perspective, a tremendous amount of continuity. And then on the programmatic side, similarly, focus on sustaining and now modernizing the triad, ICBMs, SLBMs, heavy bombers, and the related weapons. Real priority on investing in survivable nuclear command and control, which is also critically important for nuclear stability. And this is very much in Madeline's area of expertise, continuing to invest in the nuclear infrastructure that NNSA and the Department of Energy are responsible for. So in all of those areas, continuity. And I think that's fundamentally important. The place where we see the changes in the two weapon systems that David Trachtenberg mentioned, first a low-yield SLBM, and second, an over a longer time frame, nuclear-tipped sea-launched cruise missile, which I hope will be deployed solely on submarines, not on surface ships, because of the greater stability and survivability. I want to defer on those issues, and we can come back to those. The third point I want to make is that there's an important difference, and there's no question that the 2010 nuclear posture review was President Obama's nuclear posture review. He'd given the Prague speech. Secretary Gates forward to the 2010 nuclear posture review noted that this was an implementing mechanism for the Prague speech. There is a question, and we'll learn over time, I suppose, does this 2018 nuclear posture review signed by Secretary Mattis, does it represent the views of President Trump? President Trump's comments about having a bigger nuclear button, about bringing fire and fury to bear on North Korea in response to any aggression, cause one to wonder if that's the case. I hope that it is the case. Time will tell.
Thank you. One additional question. I think you laid that out very clearly and conceptually in a good frame, but I want to understand one further point. To the extent the Trump administration, or Secretary Mattis, the nominal author of this document, to the extent they do talk about the 2010 NPR, they do seem to want to emphasize continuity, just as you have. In those places where they acknowledge discontinuity, they seem to attribute that less to a difference in worldview, Obama versus Trump, vision of nuclear disarmament versus, big button. And they want to say more that it's that the world's changed since 2010, and we've seen in particular Russia's more aggressive behavior. Do you accept that interpretation that most of what's changed, to the extent there is change from 2010 to 2018, most of it is in the international security environment rather than in the occupant of the White House here in Washington?
Yeah, I can't speak to the involvement of the occupant of the White House in this review, as I noted. But I do agree that the world situation has changed substantially relative to 2009 and 2010, when the Obama administration's nuclear posture review was done. Most notably, North Korea has advanced its missile and nuclear capabilities, and I believe that's an important reason to look at bolstering our extended deterrence posture, the so-called U.S. nuclear umbrella. And second, I also agree that Russia has continued to invest very substantially in tactical nuclear weapons and has displayed those nuclear weapons and its posture associated with them in multiple exercises, and its rhetoric has been such that thinking about how to bolster deterrence of Russian coercion or attack using nuclear weapons is appropriately an important focus of this review. And I'll just say, I'm sure we'll talk about later, but I'll say I think the steps that were taken in this review with the low-yield SLBM weapon and with the nuclear SLCM both make good sense given those changes.
So I do have one final follow-up, and then we'll move on to Bob Einhorn and then Madeline and James. You mentioned North Korea and Russia. You didn't mention China explicitly. Of course, you're being very concise and cogent. But I want to give you a chance to speak now about China. One striking dimension of the national security strategy and then the national defense strategy of the Trump administration, they tend to paint China and Russia with a similar brush. And the NPR does a little bit of that as well. Personally, I see China's nuclear behavior as much more restrained than Russia's. And so I'm a little bit concerned about the single brush. I wondered if you wanted to comment on that question as well.
Michael, I agree with your assessment. And my focus on North Korea and Russia was intentional. Yeah. Both of them have advanced their nuclear capabilities over the last 8 years. And in each in its own way is relying significantly on nuclear weapons, not only for deterrence, but for coercive capability. China has, as you know, has a no first use nuclear policy. I find that relatively credible, and I believe that their behavior and their modernization programs are consistent with what one would expect, given their no first use policy for a country that is not just a to-be rising great power, but is a great power today, and establishing a diverse set of capabilities so that the People's Republic of China leadership can be confident that they have a secure second strike capability is a sensible set of steps from my perspective. it would be surprising to me if a great power took a different approach.
Thank you. Bob, let me turn to you. And again, we've been wrestling with the question of how much change, how much continuity. I know you've been thinking a lot about declaratory posture. How would you sum up the overall situation? Do you see more continuity than change from this nuclear posture to what had preceded it?
Thanks, Mike. The sum of both continuity and change. Like the 2010 NPR, the 2018 NPR preserves the option for the United States to use nuclear weapons in response to both nuclear and non-nuclear aggression. As Jim just pointed out, both NPRs therefore reject the idea that deterrence of nuclear attack should be the sole purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons. So there's some continuity there. Also, and David Trachtenberg mentioned this, like the 2010 NPR, the Trump NPR says the United States will only consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances when the vital interests of the United States, its allies and partners are at stake. But there's an important difference here, at least in my view. The 2018 NPR defines extreme circumstances more broadly to include non-nuclear strategic attacks against U.S. allies, United States, and U.S. Partners. Now, the Trump NPR doesn't really define non-nuclear strategic attack. It doesn't explain what would make a nuclear attack strategic. Instead, it provides some examples. Non-nuclear attacks against civilian population centers and critical civilian infrastructure, against early warning, command and control, attack assessment capabilities. Now, previously, before the current NPR, the U.S. maintained the option to use nuclear weapons in response to massive conventional aggression to stave off a major strategic defeat. For example, the Warsaw Pact overrunning Western Europe, China conquering Taiwan, North Korea crossing the DMZ and occupying Seoul. The U.S. also preserved the option to use nuclear weapons in response to a non-nuclear WMD attack, equivalent to the use of nuclear weapons in lethality, such as a truly mass casualty biological weapons attack. These circumstances, in my view, set a very high bar for the U.S. initiation of the use of nuclear weapons. The examples that are provided in the Trump NPR, I think, lowers the bar. The use of nuclear weapons, in my view, would hardly be the most effective, proportionate, or credible way to respond to, for example, conventional bombing of population centers, conventional or cyber attack against critical infrastructure such as the electrical grid, or kinetic or cyber attack against warning or C-cubed assets. In my view, a better way to protect those potential targets is to make them more resilient, redundant, or defensible, and to threaten to retaliate with more credible but still highly potent non-nuclear means. The Trump administration may believe that declaring a readiness to use nuclear weapons in a wider range of circumstances will enhance deterrence. But I think such a declaratory policy has some significant downsides. If an adversary believes that the United States will use nuclear weapons early in a conflict, it may calculate that it's better off using nuclear weapons first. And concerns that the administration may be increasing the role of nuclear weapons if this perception were to become widespread in the American public, it could undermine the domestic consensus that is required to pursue the recapitalization of the U.S. Deterrent. The Trump administration may have been motivated, at least to some extent, by a political impulse to adopt a more robust approach to deterrence than its predecessors. But the 2018 NPR declaratory policy may raise some serious questions about the administration's nuclear intentions and might even do so without significantly increasing deterrence.
Bob, thank you. Just one follow-up for you. Do you have a sense there were certain scenarios the administration may have had in mind of this sort of non-nuclear strategic variety that they were really concerned about, that we had somehow underappreciated the severity? For example, high-altitude nuclear burst. I guess that would be a nuclear attack. But the equivalent in a cyber realm, for example, that brought down much of our national electricity grid and sort of put us on our heels as a nation for a year or what have you as we tried to rebuild the electricity infrastructure. Do you think it was specific scenarios like that, or was it a broader sense of just wanting to leave a sharper contrast with predecessors?
I'm not sure of that, and I think the administration will be under pressure in the weeks and months to come to begin to articulate what kinds of scenarios they would consider to be the kind of non-nuclear strategic attack that could warrant, our consideration of nuclear use. I think some of the scenarios you mentioned are in their minds, but clearly the administration is going to be reluctant to be drawn out into specifics. I think it believes that ambiguity enhances deterrence, but I think ambiguity can be confusing. And it could lead some U.S. adversaries to jump to the wrong conclusion that the U.S. really is prepared to initiate nuclear war early in a conventional conflict. I think this is going to be, it may be difficult to sell current declaratory policy. I think, fortunately for the administration, issues like the price tag of modernization and the supplements, the nuclear SLICM, the low-yield SLBM, those are easier to grasp onto in the public debate. Declaratory policy tends to be more abstract, more complicated. So maybe the administration may avoid some very searching questions. But I think, in the kind of the strategic community, I think some of these questions about declaratory policy will become very prominent.
Thank you. So, Madeline, if I could go to you, please. I would love to just first get your thoughts on explaining to us a little bit about what might be up with these new nuclear warhead concepts, and to the extent you want to talk about your understanding of those. So, Secretary Trachtenberg said that the SLBM, the submarine-launched variant, would be a minor modification to existing warhead type. I guess we can all guess what that might mean, and maybe you're not comfortable in an open forum speculating yourself, but if you can give us any insight into how you can have a much lower yield warhead that's only a modest or minor modification. And then secondly, for this would-be cruise missile warhead, what kind of time frame do you sense might be required to get to a point where that would be feasible?
Thanks, Michael. I want to actually start with another little twist.
Please.
In really a bit of the emphasis on this, and that's really the lack of emphasis on nonproliferation, threat reduction that was in the 2010 NPR. So in terms of tone, although as both Jim and Bob have said, a lot of the policies are relatively consistent, I think this lack of emphasis on threat reduction and nonproliferation is telling. And the reason I say that is even though there is good language with respect to staying in New START, and both Russia and the U.S. have come into compliance now with New START, what's missing is really any commitment to the 5-year extension, which is in New START. So, I mean, I understand the reticence to have any further discussions with Russia on new treaties. Russia's made it very clear that they're not interested in that. But even the omission of the 5-year extension, I think, is telling. Now, the reason I put all that there is because I think it does have some influence on the language that deals with the nuclear weapons infrastructure at NNSA, because I think that is much more subtle in this NPR, but I think in many respects it is much different from the previous NPR. So we all know that the infrastructure at NNSA, large parts of it, it's very old, it's very outdated, it needs to be replaced, and it's been a long process to get, and difficult, and expensive to get some of that infrastructure going in terms of the replacement. What NNSA has been doing, and this is more to your point, is that it has been doing the life extensions on the existing warheads. Okay, so the plan, as I understand it from the NPR, is to take some number of the warhead for the D5, the ballistic missile, currently on the Columbia-class submarines. So this W-76 is the one that's almost finished with the life extension. This was the first big life extension. And my understanding is that they will do something to it. I actually don't know exactly what they're going to do to modify it so that it's not the single high yield, and that it will have, I think, based on the reading of this, is that it will have a single low yield. Now, what that actually isn't terribly clear, but based on some of the reading, it's probably not a new warhead, but it is a new military purpose. Okay, so there's you've got that debate. The second piece is the supplement for the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile. So right now, the Air Force and the NNSA are developing an air-launched cruise missile, and have decided that the warhead on that air-launched cruise missile will be the modified W-80, which is what's currently on the air-launched cruise missile, and in fact was on the old TLAM-N, the old nuclear Tomahawk. So my guess would be that if this Sea-Launched Cruise Missile goes forward, that the warhead on that, just like in the past, would probably be the modified W-80, which, once it's gone through life extension, will be the W-80-4. The first production unit for that 80-4 is until 2024. So all of this is very much out there in terms of timing. And that first set of 80-4s is really going to be for the air-launched cruise missile. So again, if that's the way they go, that's not a new warhead, but and in fact sort of a return to an old capability.
So one more question for you before I go to James, who I hope may address this question as well. With your physicist background and your unclassified, like me, unclassified background and approach to these questions, you may be more willing to or able to speculate about how you make an SLBM warhead with a much lower yield without testing and without much work. But in any event, Madeline, thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about the fairly ambitious plans to modernize the Department of Energy NNSA infrastructure that we see in this NPR. And it seems to me, as you point out, you were part of an administration that worked very hard, just as its two predecessors had, to sustain the U.S. nuclear arsenal without nuclear testing. The last time we tested was 1992. And that was a concept that was well accepted. We've been spending close to $10 billion a year on science-based stockpile stewardship and also refurbishment. We've done a lot of hard work. We continue to have major weapons labs devoted to this. You oversaw a lot of that work. All of that was ongoing and didn't necessarily need a big injection of additional funding. But now we see in this 2018 NPR a commitment to build up an infrastructure that could produce up to 80 new warheads a year if necessary. And that strikes me as worth really focusing on as a separate issue from all the things that you were so rigorously and attentively focused to in the past. Do you see all that ambitious planning and spending as necessary, or would you perhaps either delay that or scale it back or not do any of it altogether?
So I think this is exactly what you just described, is exactly what I think is a very subtle change in this NPR from the last NPR. There's a much more aggressive approach to the NSA infrastructure. And the rationale for this more aggressive approach isn't just to maintain the capability to maintain our stockpile through stockpiled stewardship, but there is a subtle shift here. The NPR talks about increasing test readiness. The new NPR talks about pits, but it uses somewhat new language. It talks about at least 80 pits, and before the discussion was really 50 to 80. It talks about really pursuing the new statutorily mandated stockpile responsiveness program in a very aggressive way so that you're having the labs and the plants really do prototyping almost, doing design, maybe even doing a little metal bending. So you've got a lot of things that are being put in place that, and also some of the discussion with respect to hedging, that really looks like it's laying the foundation for a much larger arsenal down the road. I mean, that's how I would interpret this. So whether it becomes that or not, obviously, is something that only the future knows, but it certainly seems to be building a more capable infrastructure.
So larger arsenal and perhaps also new kinds of warheads someday with this hedged language on testing. Mm-hmm. We're not going to do it now, but maybe someday we might reserve the right to return.
Yes.
James, I know that among the panel, we just heard some concerns from Madeline Creedon and from Bob and Jim, but you may be the sharpest critic of any of us, or at least I'll invite you to be that if you wish. So let me just address to you the very simple question of, what do you find most concerning about the NPR, as well as anything you want to say that you applaud or support?
Let me first weigh into this debate about continuity versus change. Mike, I think that government reports are a bit like T-shirts. In the real world, there's only so many changes you can make, right? Any T-shirt has to have 2 holes for your arms to come out and 1 hole to put over your head. And in the same way, there are limits to how much you can change a government report. So obviously, there's elements of continuity with previous NPRs. But I think within the range of NPRs that one could imagine a government of the United States conceivably producing, this one is much more change than continuity. Let me identify 4 different areas. Firstly is the changes in declaratory policy that Bob, I think, has very ably outlined. And let me emphasize just one thing here. The United States is now threatening to use nuclear weapons in response to attacks that would almost certainly kill not a single human being. I'm referring here to attacks against space-based elements of the US nuclear command and control system. Those attacks could be extremely consequential. I'm not playing down their significance. I think threatening to respond with nuclear weapons to those is dangerous and incredible. Secondly, this document does not make any attempt to reassure Russia about the survivability of its nuclear forces. For decades, the United States has been willing to say, whatever incredibly serious political disagreements we have with Russia, including at the moment its annexation of territory from 2 sovereign states, we accept that we are in a relationship of mutual deterrence with Russia, and we're not going to try to undermine Russia's nuclear arsenal. This document does not do that. Thirdly, for practical intents and purposes, this document takes arms control off the table. It pays lip service to arms control. It doesn't completely exclude the possibility of doing it, but it's lip service. There is no serious constructive arms control agenda laid out. And fourthly, there's this issue of new capabilities, which are quite rightly, the framers of this NPR, in my opinion, rightly have concerns about Russia and about Russian first use. The issue here, though, is I think our fundamental problem is not with Russia's willingness to use nuclear weapons first. We don't have a no first use declaratory policy. We reserve the right to use nuclear weapons first if we were losing a large-scale conventional war. The problem we have with Russia is its combination of conventional superiority around the Baltics coupled to threats of first use. It's those 2 things together. We're worried that Russia might overtake the Baltic states because NATO is conventionally weak there, and then use nuclear threats to try to deter NATO from taking back NATO's territory. I think we should worry about that. I think that's a real problem. But when you frame the problem in the way that I've just done, that the root cause of the problem is conventional weakness around the Baltics, for me, the best solution to that is let's become less conventionally weak around the Baltics. I don't mean we should put hundreds of thousands of troops into the Baltics and have a capability that could match Russia. But what the theory of conventional deterrence tells us is conventional deterrence fails when the other side believes it can execute a rapid and bloodless fait accompli. Right now, Russia is so conventionally superior around the Baltics, it could take those territory in a matter of just a few days with minimal number of casualties. That's a huge problem, in my opinion. Having enough conventional force around the Baltics that Russia would sustain a bloody nose if it tried to take over the Baltics, that it would take 2 weeks of effort and tens or hundreds of thousands of casualties rather than 2 days and hundreds of casualties, I think would enhance our deterrence posture around the Baltic much, much more than 2 different types of new nuclear warheads would. Now, I don't want to go on for too long. I think there are real additional dangers and costs associated with these new warheads. But the big idea I want to get across here is the problem with addressing these security problems in a nuclear posture review is you inevitably end up looking for nuclear solutions to that. To my mind, there is a real security threat from Russia out there, and I don't play that down in any way. But I do think that our fundamental response to that is much more effective in the non-nuclear domain than in the nuclear domain.
Outstanding. Here's what I'd like to do. In about 10 minutes, we'll get to your questions. I'm going to offer a couple of thoughts, putting on my old CBO hat, the job I held 25 years ago when Jim Miller was effectively my boss back then, working with Les Aspin, as well as a number of other members of Congress. And we did some studies on the future cost of nuclear forces in the aftermath of the Cold War. I want to look at some of the budget numbers for the modernization strategy, and then work down the row one more time for anyone to offer any additional comments, either in regard to that or in regard to what they've heard from each other. We'll do all of that fairly quickly and then get to you. Let me offer the following. We saw in this document, and we've seen, I think, in other Trump administration statements over recent months, the constant reiteration of nuclear modernization as being the top priority, which was also the Obama administration's view, and often the comments that you would hear from Obama administration officials. I remember once we had Admiral Richardson, the CNO, here, and I challenged him a little bit in a friendly way as to whether that was the right way to think about nuclear modernization, and he said absolutely it must be, because our submarines are getting old. The Ohio class need to be replaced. They're not going to be safe anymore. And what I'd like to propose to you is that we look a little more critically at the overall price tag of estimated at $1.3 trillion for the full modernization agenda. And I want to suggest we may need to prioritize. Right now, there are 5, as I define them, 5 big categories of nuclear modernization in Trump administration plans, mostly consistent with Obama administration plans. There is the replacement of the SSBN force, the ballistic missile-armed nuclear submarines, the Ohio class becoming the Columbia class. There is the B-21 bomber, the Raider, being built. And that, among all these capabilities, has dual purpose, conventional as well as nuclear. There is the desire to replace the Minuteman ICBM force. Even though it's been around for a long time already, there are some questions as to how much longer it could remain in effect. There is the nuclear command and control that Jim and others have talked about being seen as vulnerable to cyber attack, to nuclear attack, just getting old itself. And then finally, the whole Department of Energy nuclear weapons infrastructure question. I would like to put forth a very simple conceptual point. First of all, that I'm not persuaded by the math that I see in the NPR. It claims that this entire agenda will never lead to a higher percentage of the defense budget for nuclear modernization than about 6.5%. I think that's a very low estimate. When I do the math, I come up with a number closer to 10%. And that doesn't even include Madeline's domain of the nuclear weapons activities of the Department of Energy, which are, when you add up cleanup and everything else, close to another $20 billion. So this is real money. And I think right now there's a little bit of a giddiness in Washington. The defense budget is more or less fully funded robustly across all domains. I don't think that's likely to be the case. So I think we need to start to prioritize and at least have a debate about which of these 5 areas of modernization are most important. To my mind, there are 3 that are clearly more important than the other 2. That's my own analytical judgment. Others may disagree on this panel or among all of you or elsewhere in town. But I think clearly we do need to replace the nuclear-armed submarines. They're getting old. They're not going to be safe for our sailors that much longer. They're already pushing 40-year service lives, which is far and away the longest we ever operated a submarine in the United States. So I fully support, you can debate the numbers and the specific details, fully support replacing the Ohio class with the Columbia class.
Michael, if I may, they're
Please.
Also the most survivable strategic system.
So another,
and they carry the bulk of our strategic warheads.
Right, thank you. I also fully support the B-21 Raider because I see it as being so useful for conventional warfighting. It is one of our asymmetric advantages in conventional warfighting, long-range stealth bomber. You'll recall we already have a stealth bomber, but we've only got 20 of them in the B-2 force. And any kind of large-scale deterrence of large-scale conventional conflict, I think is going to require substantially more long-range stealth than that. So for me, the overwhelming argument for the B-21 is the dual capability of that platform. And I'm very glad to see that it's, at least at the moment, robustly being funded. Finally, nuclear command and control. And with Jim Miller here, I could have mentioned his affiliation with the Defense Science Board. A year ago, the Defense Science Board put out a report that I still lose sleep over occasionally because it talked about how we really couldn't vouch for the cyber resilience of any of our nuclear systems. It didn't go so far as to say they're all vulnerable to being taken down tomorrow by hackers, but it said there are questions about basically all of them that we're going to need a decade to remedy. And so to the extent that we can't vouch for the integrity of our nuclear command and control, that's got to be seen as a top-tier problem. On the DOE, we've already heard a lot of questions and criticisms, or at least doubts about some of the more ambitious planning there. And finally, on the ICBM force, I think we can probably delay it the way that RAND, the way that GAO have examined, by finding a way to shrink it somewhat so that some of the existing deployed missiles become a repository of test missiles, because there's a certain number of test flights you have to do per year. If you do a combination of refurbishment of the Minuteman force and a modest downsizing, I think you can maybe buy another 5, 10, 15 years before you have to replace it. In any event, if resources get tight, I think we need to have these kinds of options in mind. So it might be nice to do all 5. I'm not sure we're going to have the funding. That's my little sermonette for the day. And so now, without further ado, and without any more questions from me, there's a lot on the table already. I'm just going to ask my colleagues up here to offer any further thoughts they'd like before we get into the discussion. And we'll just work down the row, starting with Madeline.
Well, the one thing you forgot is also the Joint Strike Fighter. So the F-35 also has an important role in terms of being the dual-capable aircraft for delivery of the non-strategic warheads. So again, like the bomber, it has 2 very important missions, both primarily dominated by the conventional side. But again, it's part of this mix. And as you mentioned, and probably one more you forgot. At some point, we're going to have to come back around and do something with the D5, which is the missile that's on the Columbia class and that will then transition, or on the Ohio class and will transition to the Columbia class. So at some point, it's going to have to go through a life extension. And then, in addition to all of the physical infrastructure at NNSA, there's also the physical infrastructure at DoD, which is also not discussed very much in the NPR. Other than, I think there's a very quick mention of the modernization of the silos themselves for the Minuteman III/Minuteman IV. And then the other large problem out there is you also have a people infrastructure that really has to be paid attention to as we transition from a period of time from the Cold War where there was testing of some of these warheads to a period of time where we've made the handoff for the most part from the folks who had testing experience to the scientists and engineers now who are taking it forward, and the next big transition will be when they hand off to that next generation. And to do that, we also have to have a significant investment in long-term science and engineering for stockpiled stewardship. And that's not very well laid out in the NPR as well. And then finally, as we get rid of the 40 to 60% of these old buildings across both the DoD and the NNSA complex, we have to pay to get rid of them. And that's another big unpaid bill. So, I mean, I am in complete agreement with you that some of these rough estimates, the $1.3 trillion, all of this are pretty low.
Thank you. Jim.
Michael, I agree with your concern about the cost associated with the nuclear programs writ large. At the same time, I fundamentally agree with what Secretary Mattis said, as David paraphrased at least, which is that we can afford survival. I'll put it differently. We can't afford not to invest in the national security that we absolutely need. No one else is going to take care of our nuclear deterrent force. In fact, our nuclear deterrent forms a nuclear umbrella for key allies and partners around the world. So to me, if it's 7%, if it's 10%, that's an acceptable price. It doesn't mean that any nuclear program, let alone all of them, should get a free ride. You probably remember that Secretary Gates, when he was secretary, did a hard scrub both of the Columbia-class SSBN and of the B-21. At one time, he canceled the program. It took us over a year and a half to come back with recommendations for a new program that was believed to be, and let's hope it is, more cost-effective. So both within programs and across programs, we need to be asking those questions. My own view is that although the department has concluded so far that the most cost-effective way to go forward with an ICBM leg is to modernize, that you're probably right that if one takes down the overall size of the force a bit from the 400 deployed today to a somewhat smaller number, that one could buy time. I'll say my own recommendation in that regard is not going to save a lot of money, because I believe the most important role of the ICBM leg of the triad is to hedge against any future problem with the submarine leg. Don't see it today, could see it 20, 30 years down the road. So a hedge program that includes some research and development on potential mobile options for a future ICBM, to me, makes more sense than putting a whole bunch of hundreds more in silos in the near term.
Thank you. Bob.
Having a sustainable deterrent requires very broad domestic support. This NPR, the Trump NPR, builds on what President Obama did. President Obama actually had a very robust modernization program, and the Trump administration follows that. Where the Trump administration departs, where it's less continuity than change, in some areas that I think will raise questions about the ability to sustain that national consensus. The idea of new nuclear systems, a declaratory policy that suggests that the U.S. is prepared to use nuclear weapons in a wider range of circumstances. I think these will create challenges for building that kind of national consensus. And I think it's important that the administration do more to build that broad support, including a number of panelists have suggested in the area of arms control in particular. There are easy things that could be done, simply agreeing to what the Russians have apparently proposed, which is a 5-year extension of New START. I think Dave Trachtenberg talked about this earlier, and the administration will have to try to keep this consensus together. But it will be a challenge with the current NPR.
Thank you. And finally, James.
So, as some of you may know, a pre-decisional draft of the Nuclear Posture Review leaked in the Huffington Post a few weeks ago. And you can compare the original draft to the published version. The single most interesting change, in my opinion, was in the letter from Secretary Mattis at the beginning. And in the draft, it said that nuclear modernization was, quote, the top priority of the Department of Defense. And in the final version, it is a top priority of the Department of Defense. And you don't need to have served in government to understand, which I haven't, to understand that the difference between the top priority and a top priority is a very significant difference. And the fact that this change was made in the letter from the Secretary of Defense himself, I don't know who made the change, but I would hazard a guess that it was the Secretary of Defense himself that made that change, given that it was in the letter that was signed by him. If I'm right about that, and I have no idea if I am or not, that suggests to me that your assumption that there will have to be trade-offs made in the nuclear budget, I think is exactly right. And if there are trade-offs made, then I totally agree with Mike about where those should be made. Let me just say one thing about nuclear command and control, which is an area that I'm worried we're shortchanging at the moment. For me, it's kind of balmy to be looking at a third and fourth low-yield nuclear option. And that's what the low-yield SLICM and the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile are. They will be the third and fourth low-yield options. When we acknowledge we have a vulnerable command and control system on which everything depends. The fundamental challenge, I think, with command and control today is that so many of the US assets for command and control are dual use. They're used for both conventional and nuclear missions. The advanced extremely high-frequency satellites, communication satellites, would be used to transmit execution orders to nuclear forces. They're used by special operators. They're used by ground forces. They're used by naval forces. So, the other side may have an incentive to attack those in a war to undermine our conventional warfighting ability, and that would have huge implications for our command and control system. As an analyst at a think tank, I can come up with ideas for rectifying this problem cheaply. And as is very well known, every time analysts in think tanks come up with cheap ideas, they always work out that way when they're implemented in practice. There's never, it's so easy to implement these ideas in practice. My sense is, in the current security environment, particularly in the face of developments in anti-satellite weapons and cyber weapons, actually building a resilient and redundant command and control system has the potential to be an extraordinarily expensive prospect. To my mind, that is the single biggest priority we as a nation face when it comes to nuclear forces at the moment.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go to all of you. Please wait for a microphone and identify yourself. I'll take about 3 questions at a time, if I could. We'll start here in the third row and then work our way a little bit backwards.
My name is Heinz Gärtner. I'm with the Transatlantic Center at the moment. No one mentioned disarmament. So non-nuclear weapon states would argue that the Non-Proliferation Treaty has at least 2 legs, and one is non-proliferation and the other one is disarmament, enshrined in Article 6 of the NPT. The NPR explicitly rejects disarmament in the context of the PEN Treaty. So what about your thoughts about disarmament and the NPR and the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Thank you. Let's see I'll go to the woman in the red shirt, and then we'll come over here for the gentleman on the far aisle, and then back to the panel.
Susan Burke, formerly with the State Department. This is a question about low yield. As someone who's a veteran of multilateral non-proliferation negotiations, I think, notwithstanding this excellent discussion, this is going to be a really hard sell to the international community. But there seems to be a real focus on low yield as if that's somehow better. And I just would like some sort of comment on that. I've seen, low yield as a Hiroshima-type bomb. Do we know what we're talking about there? Is this somehow better? And I think that is a discussion that's going on social media and so forth, is what exactly is meant.
Great, thank you. And then over here, please. I'll start with you, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Rafael from the Brazilian Embassy. We have heard a lot on the rationale for the NPR regarding other nuclear powers or American allies. But I would like to hear, please, some comments on the impact of the NPR on other countries and on the future of the non-proliferation regime. Since we understand that the nuclear power countries are redoubling their bet on their nuclear arsenal, what is this message conveying to other countries? And lastly, regarding the CTBT, it's explicit in the NPR that the United States will not pursue its ratification. What do you think would be the future of this structure that we have for more than 20 years and is not in force? Thank you very much.
Great. So we've got a couple of questions on sort of warhead-related issues and then a couple of questions on broader disarmament strategy. Maybe I'd ask Madeline to begin, and whichever questions you wish, and each person can then comment on one or two.
Well, let me talk a little bit about sort of the CTBT and how it relates, I think, to the NPT and our commitment to Article 6. So the one good thing about this new NPR is that it does commit to continuing the moratorium, which is good. I don't think it was a surprise that there's no interest in seeking CTBT ratification from this administration. But to me, the thing that was most important, and which had been swirling for a while, is there is a stated commitment to the CTBTO and also to the international monitoring system. That is hugely important in terms of making sure that the foundational abilities to monitor and to monitor testing will remain in place and will continue to grow. there's also a comment in there about support to the IAEA as well. So that, at least, I think, in many respects, tempers what is frankly something that was expected in terms of not seeking ratification of the CTBT. The two other big issues on Article 6 really get back to the change in emphasis on this NPR and the lack of significant focus on further reductions or really working to achieve zero, and with more emphasis on securing nuclear materials and making sure others don't continue with any terrorists or other development of nuclear weapons. So yeah, I am concerned about this, but I think from a U.S. perspective, the most important thing we can do is get that 5-year extension to the New START treaty.
Secretary Miller.
Good. Let me start by strongly agreeing with Madeleine about the importance of extending the New START treaty, and that should be an easy, straightforward decision for the Trump administration and should be a priority. The United States has benefited not only from the reductions that we would have in Russian strategic forces without a treaty, but from the data exchanges that occur on an ongoing basis every year, and on the 18 annual inspections that we're able to undertake. Significantly reduces the prospects for worst-case planning on both military sides. On the question of disarmament, and it's worth noting that this NPR does say that the administration continues the long-term goal of a world without nuclear weapons. What it says is that goal looks further away, not closer than it did. I took it as a positive that it still included that goal. What does concern me, and Bob Einhorn articulated this well, is the subtle appearance of the expansion of the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. nuclear policy or U.S. strategy. It's below the top line. It's not the fundamental points of declaratory policy, but it does appear that there are elements of an expansion in attempting to deter additional attacks relative to what certainly the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review believed or asserted. That's important, but the bigger deal, again, to me, is not the difference between the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review and the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review. It's whether the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review reflects the view of the President of the United States, who has sole authority to direct the employment of nuclear weapons. On the question of yields, of the low-yield SLBM warhead in particular, Susan, there's no question in my mind that it's going to end up being much larger than the largest U.S. conventional weapon. So the U.S. is modernizing the so-called Massive Ordnance Penetrator, the MOP, 30,000-pound weapon. We're talking about, I would guess, at the lower yields that they would contemplate, something that is hundreds of times has more explosive potential than the largest conventional weapon that we have. And if that is the case, I certainly don't see that it reduces the nuclear threshold. It may be a more credible response to nuclear use. And to the extent that this Nuclear Posture Review focuses on that role of nuclear weapons, the fundamental purpose of nuclear weapons to deter nuclear use by others, I think it goes in the right direction. To the extent that it in any way expands that role relative to where it is or where it has been in the past, I think it goes in the wrong direction.
Thanks. Bob.
There was a question about the international response to the NPR. I think it'll be mixed, I think. Many U.S. allies and partners around the world will like the NPR. The idea of enhancing extended deterrence, countering possible Russian interest in initiating the use of limited use of nuclear weapons. I think our Baltic allies, Eastern European allies, and our Northeast Asian allies will find a lot to like in this NPR. Japan is an interesting case. Japan is the only country that's been the victim of nuclear attack and has been a strong proponent of nuclear disarmament. But the day after the NPR was issued, the Japanese foreign minister came out with a very strong statement of support for the NPR. The Japanese relied heavily, in their view, relied heavily on the nuclear Tomahawk, the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile, and were upset when it was retired. I think they'll be very happy with the resurrection of this capability. I think the South Koreans also will see a lot to like. Many other non-nuclear weapon states, non-aligned non-nuclear weapon states, won't be happy with it. They'll be at least relieved that the administration retained the negative security assurance, the assurance that the U.S. will not use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states party to the NPT in compliance with their non-proliferation obligations. They'll be relieved by that, but I think they'll be concerned about the implication that the U.S. may be increasing the role of nuclear weapons in its strategy. The non-aligned have been unhappy with the slow pace of disarmament. Nothing in this NPR will change that, but I don't think it will qualitatively change that. It may give stronger support for the nuclear ban movement, but I don't think it's going to fundamentally affect the prospects for proliferation. I think countries don't pursue nuclear weapons because they don't believe that having them is essential to their national security. I don't think this is going to change that very much. James.
Thanks, Mike. Let me tackle both the questions that brought disarmament into the fray. As the questioner correctly pointed out, the document, the NPR, does reject the ban treaty, as did the Obama administration before it, and any U.S. administration would have done. It doesn't it does endorse the long-term goal of a world without nuclear weapons. I think that was not a foregone conclusion that statement would be in this NPR. Nonetheless, there's clearly a big difference in emphasis between the Trump administration's position on disarmament and its predecessors. Now, the logic of the Obama administration, and let me say this with some modesty because the three people sitting to my right were deeply involved in crafting the logic of the Obama administration, and I wasn't. But when President Obama in Prague renewed the U.S. commitment to a world without nuclear weapons, my interpretation of what that strategy was is building upon the argument made by many non-nuclear weapon states that if you want us to do more on non-proliferation, you guys, the weapon states, have to do more on disarmament. And the effort was a very kind of hard-nosed, security-driven logic that by doing more on the Obama administration, by doing more on disarmament, the Obama administration was trying to catalyze a coalition to work on non-proliferation. It wasn't, as is sometimes claimed, that the Obama administration thought that if the US gave up nuclear weapons, North Korea would do so as well. It was that the practical tools we need to deal with non-proliferation, the more widespread adoption of enhanced IEA safeguards, the more rigorous enforcement of export controls, of sanctioning countries that break the rules. Doing that required a political quid pro quo between disarmament and non-proliferation. Let me say two things about implementing that strategy in practice. The first one is that efforts to abolish nuclear weapons can be led by the US, but it can't be done by the US solely. The Obama administration was absolutely willing to continue negotiations with further reductions with Russia. The Russians had no interest in doing so. China won't even enter into a serious dialogue with the US about nuclear weapons and further reductions. Are there barriers to disarmament here in the US? Absolutely. Are there also barriers in other countries that sometimes get ignored when criticism gets heaped on the US? Yes. And secondly, I was really disappointed by the reception amongst many non-nuclear weapon states to the Prague speech. Not one single head of state, somebody of an equivalent stature of Obama, stood up and welcomed that speech and pledged to work with him. Not one. Standing up alone as opposed to in the Security Council. So, it's not my job to tell non-nuclear weapon states how they would respond to the NPR. I would love to hear more from non-nuclear weapon states about their response to the NPR. All I would say is, if in a future administration you want the US to take disarmament more seriously, I think the more that there is public support for efforts made by a US president on disarmament, and let's not forget how politically brave the Prague speech was, The more that kind of effort is endorsed and welcomed by other states, the more chance there is to make it sustainable.
We'll do one more round here in just a second. First, I have two clarifying points or additional points. One, I think you've heard us reference the Prague speech. Of course, for those of you who may have forgotten, this was President Obama's April 2009 speech early in his presidency, really articulating the vision of a nuclear-free world at a time when it still seemed conceivable that we could make near-term progress towards that. Obama didn't have any utopian view that this could happen fast. I think he questioned in the speech whether it could even happen in his lifetime, but it seemed a more thinkable kind of concept back then, and that's why you've heard some people refer back to it, just for those of you who may not follow this stuff quite as much as some of us do. And then secondly, my own personal speculation on the low-yield warhead, without having been read in to have the kind of security clearances on this subject that would enable me to know the real answer and not be able to say it. So I'll give potentially wrong answer, but I will say it. And this is based on a lot of what's come out over the years from what we know about nuclear weapons design, writings by people like Frank von Hippel and Richard Garwin that I've tried to devour over my career. And I think the simplest way we can understand this, you know that modern American nuclear weapons are essentially two-stage. They're thermonuclear, hydrogen bombs. What that means is a first nuclear detonation, sort of in spirit like a Hiroshima or Nagasaki bomb, goes off. That creates the necessary temperature and pressure to then ignite the hydrogen fuel in the secondary. So you need a small nuclear burst to make a big one. The simplest way to take one of those weapons and turn it from a big yield weapon into a small yield weapon is to get rid of the secondary, or to contaminate the hydrogen fuel with something that's not going to ignite as much and not produce as much yield. And what I don't know, what I don't claim to even be able to speculate about, is just how much you can dial down the yield of that secondary sort of as you wish without particular new design or testing. But I do think it's fairly predictable that you could simply eliminate the secondary or render it inert in one way or another. And therefore, you could wind up with yields that are probably somewhat smaller. And Jim was hinting at this with the way he talked about scaling up from the MOAB by a factor of 100 or hundreds. Probably in the 1 kiloton range is what you could fairly confidently produce as a readily available weapon out of this kind of approach. That's just my hopefully informed speculation, not based on classified information, not speaking for anybody else on the panel or the NPR. By the way, one last thing, I'm going to make a personal note to thank Steve Pfeiffer. Steve Pfeiffer, he's in the audience today. He's been a person here at Brookings who's written a lot of nuclear weapons issues over the years. He will continue to do so, but from a sunnier perch in California, where we thought he might already be today, which is part of why he's not up on the panel. But when we get to the end, I'm going to ask you to not only thank the panelists, but thank Steve. But we'll hold off on that until after the last round. So, yes, sir, in the back with the...
Thanks. I'm Jeff Price at Johns Hopkins SAIS. First, on the lower yield Trident, I think Bob Suver was quoted in Defense News as talking about primary only, so that's unclassified. And my question goes to the crisis stability implications of effectively using a strategic delivery system for a non-strategic warhead or mission. There's a lot of ways to deliver a lower yield warhead in a regional crisis. And some of the questions that arise with the Trident in particular is this is in some way using your end game capability, your secure second strike capability at the beginning of a limited nuclear confrontation. And there's certain questions that I think the discussion needs to be had about whether that's, the wisdom of that and the implications of that in a crisis, which is by definition a nuclear crisis.
Thank you. We'll see if we can take one or two more. Woman in the very back of the room in the aqua shirt, please.
Hello, my name is Alicia Dressman. I'm a nuclear policy specialist. I have a quick question for Madeline Creedon and then a question for Jim Miller. Madeline Creedon, do you see in the future interoperable warhead LEP that would require modification of the physics package, knowing that right now they're focusing on the non-nuclear components? For Jim Miller, you mentioned road mobile ICBMs as a future alternative. Obviously, in the recent Air Force AOA, they canceled that option. Could you gauge qualitatively the hunger for a road mobile option, knowing, of course, that Russia just slashed that because they're broke, as usual? Thank you.
And I'll take one more before we finish up here with the panelists. So I'll go here to the fourth row, please.
Aaron Simpson, and question for Jim or others on the panel who want to answer. You put forward a reduction in the overall size of the ICBM force, and I'm wondering if you envision that as part of long-term arms control, or you would do that unilaterally.
So in this round, which will be also our concluding statements, why don't we begin with James, and we'll give Jim the very last word since a couple of the questions were for him. So we'll go James, Bob, Madeline, and then Jim Miller.
Thanks. Let me just say talk briefly about the low-yield SLBM option, which, as I've already said, I think I'd much rather spend the money on bolstering the conventional deterrence around the Baltics. But there's two real operational issues I see with using a low-yield SLBM. The first one is you risk giving away the position of the submarine that the missile is fired from. Russia is rebuilding its constellation of early warning satellites. Those would detect a missile very shortly after launch, which would mean that Russia would know where the US Trident was fired from, which would presumably be a significant aid to Russia in hunting down US SSBNs. Now, if we're actually in a conflict where nuclear weapons are being used, it's not just a nuclear crisis, we're actually in a nuclear war by that point. I would think that keeping our most survivable forces survivable would be an incredibly high priority for US decision makers. So I actually think that if we were really in a nuclear war, the use of this option would not be an attractive one for the decision makers because there's such a high percentage of the really survivable warheads are on SSBNs. The second issue is the so-called discrimination problem, which is Russia could not distinguish between the launch of a low-yield Trident and a normal Trident. Does that increase the chance that Russia would respond with a high-yield nuclear weapon before, or multiple high-yield nuclear weapons, even worse, before our Trident exploded and Russia knew it was low-yield, if indeed it does have the capabilities to determine yield rapidly after detonation? Now, this is a very complicated issue, which I'm not going to go into a huge amount here, because time is short. All I would say is there was a proposal about 10 years ago called conventional Trident modification. I know one person on this panel in particular probably still has multiple scars from that experience. All I would say is, and that was the idea that you would take some nuclear warheads off Trident D5 and replace them with conventional warheads. Congress decided not to fund that capability because of the discrimination problem. And that was not even a capability that anyone was talking about firing at Russia. This was the issue there was using this against Iran, North Korea, maybe China. No one was arguing for using it against Russia. But the discrimination problem was deemed so severe, even though we wouldn't be firing this at Russia, that Congress didn't provide money for it. I think now we are talking about a low-yield capability specifically for the use against Russia. So I think we have to take this discrimination problem seriously, even if, the question of would Russia respond with multiple high-yield warheads as soon as it detected the launch of one of our Tridents is not that's a complex question to answer, and one that I'm not going to try to do in 5 seconds.
Thank you. Bob?
I'm going to give my time to Jim because I want to hear his answers to Jim's questions about discrimination and about exposing the location of U.S. SSBNs.
Great. Madeline, before we hear that.
Thanks a bunch.
So I just want to emphasize everything that James has said. I mean, as hard as it would be to modify a W76-1 to have a low-yield option, maybe a primary yield only, the operational considerations are going to be much, much harder, and James has only touched on them. So that is a huge issue with respect to employment. And I'll just sort of add out there that, right now our D5 missiles all have multiple warheads. So when you think about this, are you going to have multiple low-yield warheads on a single D5? Are you going to mix them with other high-yield warheads on other, the operational issues associated with this are extensive and extraordinarily complex, more so than the complexity of the warhead itself. So let me go to the IW. One of the interesting things about this NPR is I'm not sure there is any discussion of the Obama 3+2 strategy. There is a small discussion of interoperable warheads, but it has kicked it out for the future because under the Obama 3+2 strategy, sort of the next life extension up for ballistic missiles was going to be the IW-1. And it was ostensibly going to be a warhead that could be used on an ICBM and an SLBM, and it would look like something that would replace the Air Force W-78 and also the Navy's 88. The 88 is now the W-88, which is the warhead for the Navy, is going through sort of a rehab. It's not a real life extension, but it's sort of less than that. They call it an alteration, but think of it as a rehab. But it has extended the life. So as a result of that, the language in this NPR really talks about doing a life extension on the W-78. So in my mind, that means that we may have walked away from the initial 3+2 strategy and will retain 4 for a while rather than going to 3. Now, one of the interesting things that I would sort of throw out there for general discussion is maybe if there is real seriousness about thinking on low yields, maybe something that could be explored would be an IW down the road that would have variable yields, so that you're not giving up, if you will, a strategic delivery platform, but maybe you look at something that looks like an IW with variable yields for both the SLs and the ICBMs. Again, way out there, way long term. But I do think that this NPR walks away from the IWs for the interoperable warheads in any near-term thing, and has probably walked away from the 3+2 strategy.
So, Jim, we'll finish where we started. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Alicia, I have not seen a great clamor in the land for a road mobile ICBM. And indeed, I'm not arguing for that approach. What I do believe is that if you believe that the single most important role of the ICBM leg in a world where we have large numbers of weapons on the SLBM leg, our strategic submarine leg, then the most important role of the ICBM leg is to serve as a hedge against any problem with the survivability of that sea-based leg. If that happens 20 years, 30 years down the road, and I would not expect it to have any real prospect of happening any earlier than that, but it could in that time frame, then the answer of deploying more silo-based ICBMs or putting more warheads on those ICBMs would not serve strategic stability. So because of that, I think that a better program, even today, would be to go to a light rather than a heavier ICBM. The Minuteman replacement looks like it'll be about the same 78,000-pound missile as a Minuteman III. The old small ICBM was roughly half that weight, which gives it less throw weight, if we will, less capacity, but sufficient to have a single warhead plus decoys, and a more attractive candidate for going to road mobile. And to answer also Aaron's question on this topic, my recommendation, which also has not been met with great clamor in the land, including from the Defense Department, would be to go unilaterally to a lighter ICBM, to deploy perhaps a couple hundred in silos, to have them as necessary and when necessary to retain an ICBM leg, and then to have a research and development program and a demonstration program for road mobile. My guess is that would cost about the same as going forward with 400 ICBMs in silos over a period of years. The cost would be somewhat later, which is useful, but most importantly, it would provide a hedge that we otherwise will not have, and it would be a stabilizing hedge in the event that SSBNs, our strategic submarines, became vulnerable 20, 30 years more down the line. On the question of crisis stability that Jeff asked, it's a good question. My view is that a low-yield warhead on a Trident, on a D5 missile, is A, a nuclear warhead, and B, a strategic warhead. And that one should not imagine that because something is lower yield, that it's going to that will be known immediately by Russia or by anyone else, nor that it means it's not a strategic asset. So there will be significant and would be, I believe, significant hurdles, even above the hurdles that we should rightly have an employment of any nuclear weapon because it's a strategic system. And I think my guess is it's for that reason that the administration decided it would also go forward with a longer range program to have a sea-launched cruise missile that's again nuclear tipped. And let me just say that from my perspective, as a person involved in the Obama nuclear posture review, the reason for eliminating the TLAM-N, the sea-launched cruise missile with nuclear tip at that time, was not that it was either destabilizing or inappropriate to have. It's that it was at, if not past, its end of life. And the question was, at that point in time, 8 to 10 years ago, should it be a priority investment in the United States nuclear posture to reinstate that capability, or were there far more important things? At that point in time, the judgment of the president and unanimous recommendation from the Joint Chiefs, as I required as well, was that system was not necessary and was not needed to fill a gap in extended deterrence in particular. I do think that calculation has changed with respect to North Korea and with respect to Russia. And at the same time, it's a 10-year program. So as Secretary Mattis has said, it also provides an opportunity for the United States to have a development program that could be part of negotiations going forward with Russia to A, stay within INF, and B, to put its tactical nuclear weapons on the table for serious negotiations, something that the Obama administration attempted and the Russians did not agree to pursue. I still believe that would be a valuable next step, and the United States should continue to pursue extension of New START and to pursue negotiations on tactical nuclear weapons.
Fantastic. Thanks you all for being here. Please join me in thanking Steve Pifer and the panel.
Steve.